Loki is the third series in the fourth phase of the MCU, not to be confused with the Netflix Marvel Universe, which is now defunct, and the first MCU streaming show to be created with a second season in mind, as WandaVision and the Falcon and the Winter Soldier both exist to set up future films. I enjoyed Loki more because it didn't set up a future film. It felt like it told a mostly self-contained story with, as usual, a few references to the other MCU films and Easter eggs from the comics. Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of the Loki character is again on point. He was good as the character even in Thor: The Dark World, which is even worse than the critics say. I wish I could be a contrarian and tell you that it's actually a good movie, but I watched it for the first time recently, and I thought it was pretty bad. But Tom Hiddleston as Loki was a saving grace. This show operates as a character study, while Owen Wilson's Mobius M. Mobius character attempts to understand and rehabilitate the trickster god. This is the crux of the show. Loki is trapped in a bureaucratic dystopian prison world controlled by the Time Variant Authority, or TVA, whose purpose is to limit the freedom of so-called variants who have created alternate timelines through time travel. The visual metaphor of a tree having its branches clipped is how the show easily communicates its time travel logic. The job of the TVA is basically to keep the MCU from creating too many alternate universes that would branch out in conflicting ways and confuse the viewers with convoluted comic book nonsense. The imagery of the show is stellar. The futuristic society is portrayed in painstaking detail. You can feel the endless hours that it took to create some of these backgrounds. The sets look great. They really communicate a sense of existential dread, an ominous combination of bureaucracy and authoritarianism. The images feel like they are stretching into infinity, a clever reference to the principal location's existence beyond time. The costumes are good. I love the look of Loki as a time cop, or whatever he's supposed to be. Humor in Marvel movies can be really hit or miss for me because it often feels like it's humor for small children, though, right off the bat, the sci-fi jokes in Loki feel more akin to a show like Futurama, where there's just a touch of philosophy to the humor.
How can I prove I'm human?
You could drop dead. That'd show him.
I don't wanna.
Like when Loki questions whether or not he would know if he was a robot clone of himself.
What if I was a robot and I didn't know it?
The machine would melt you from the inside out. Please move along, sir.
The soundtrack composed by Natalie Holt is pretty good. Marvel soundtracks are often middling affairs, failing to stand out from the rest, and though there are moments here that have that quality of typical superhero triumphant fanfare, the mysterious Doctor Who-style synthesizers fit in nicely, and there are some mournful synth leads that also work well. There's a little variety too, like the Calypso style of the D.B. Cooper scene. Hiddleston's lead performance, and Owen Wilson's of Mobius, a sad middle-aged bureaucrat, are the show's highlights. Mobius is a bumbling old endearing fool who is a mentor and a mirror for Loki. The supporting cast is rounded out by Gugu Mbatha-Raw playing Ravonna Renslayer, who is in charge of the TVA, Wunmi Mosaku playing Hunter B-15, and Sasha Lane playing Hunter C-20, who are essentially underling characters. They begin as blandly adversarial, but gain more depth by the end. Tara Strong voices Miss Minutes, a cartoon clock with a folksy southern accent and sinister tone lurking beneath. Tara Strong has actually done a ton of cartoon and video game voice acting, including Riku in Final Fantasy X, Paz in Metal Gear Solid 5, and Harley Quinn in Arkham City and Arkham Knight. The Miss Minutes character functions as a company mascot, ominous presence, and also an exposition machine.
But then the all-knowing timekeepers emerged, bringing peace by reorganizing the multiverse into a single timeline.
A larger portion of the cast will have to be saved for spoilers because Loki takes a couple twists and turns over its brief 6-episode run. That being said, the supporting cast is fine, but Tom Hiddleston is the eponymous character, and appropriately, he's at the center of it all. Because Loki exists in this odd state of limbo, the show doesn't necessarily need to fit into other MCU products, and this is a great asset to the storytelling. It mostly exists to delve into the mind of the Loki character, a mischief-making, egotistical anti-hero who is struggling for his freedom. Unfortunately, there is that moment in the first episode, Glorious Purpose, where they have to recap a bunch of story arcs from previous Marvel movies. There's also not actually quite as much time jumping as you'd expect. In fact, let's just go ahead and get into spoilers to talk about it. The second episode ends with the reveal of a female Loki variant named Sylvie, played by Sophia DiMartino, which I'm sure caused at least someone on the internet to cry, "Loki's gone wokey."
Have any of you met a woman variant of us?
Sounds terrifying.
And admittedly, there is some forced feminism here, when it's explained that a female Loki would be superior to all other Loki variants because her gender makes her smarter and more powerful.
She's different. She's not trying to take over the TVA, she's trying to take it down.
The female variant of Loki has been hiding out on worlds near their destruction, so that her actions won't cause variations on the timeline to be created. If the world is going to be destroyed, then nothing one person could do would create an alternate future that could be tracked by the TVA. Loki and Sylvie become trapped on a future world nearing destruction, and they bond, opening up to one another. Because Loki is a character so egotistical and so narcissistic, he could only open up to another version of himself. In fact, he falls in love with Sylvie, falling in love with his mirror image, which is so on brand for the character. Also, Loki is definitively bisexual now, explained in one line of dialogue.
Would-be princesses? Or perhaps another prince?
A bit of both.
And it makes sense for the character. Disney has for a long time made decisions to not include LGBT characters, presumably partially so that they could sell movie tickets in China where people have been jailed for writing stories with LGBT characters. I speculate that they were able to go this route because it's a streaming show and they don't have to worry about ticket sales, but this is purely unfounded speculation. Anyway, I applaud Loki's coming out. I think it's unequivocally a good thing, even if it is just one line of dialogue that they'll probably edit out to sell in China anyway.
Would-be princesses? Or perhaps another prince?
After the third episode on the dying world Lamentis, the fourth episode, the Nexus event, returns to TVA, where Loki and Sylvie are held prisoner and questioned as the supporting characters slowly realize they too are prisoners of the TVA. Loki is punished in a time loop and is in the end disintegrated, which has been the TVA's method of control so far. But it turns out they don't actually die, but instead land in a harsh open world to survive in, which becomes episode 5, Journey into Mystery, a reference to the name of the comic Thor first appeared in. This episode contains many hidden references: a giant head of the villain from the Ant-Man movie, a helicopter with Thanos' name on it, a Polybius arcade machine which was rumored to be a mind control experiment, and a version of Thor who Loki has turned into a frog trapped in a jar. Oddly enough, most of the characters encountered here are variations of Loki. It's explained that Loki is so cunning that it's mostly his variations that survive. This definitely could be considered fan service, but even knowing very little about Loki from the comics, I enjoyed it. Loki has been portrayed in pop culture extensively, especially in video games like Valkyrie Profile, where he's the final boss, or God of War 2018, where he's included in an interesting way that I can't go into because of spoilers. Being that there are so many ways to approach a character initially out of Norse mythology, it felt appropriate to have various Lokis all teaming up. There's an old school Loki, played by Richard E. Grant, who is really the highlight, but there's also a young Loki, a black Loki, and an alligator Loki. Then there's President Loki and his gang of Loki thugs. This scene did feel completely unnecessary to the plot, but that doesn't mean it wasn't fun. The final episode, instead of the traditional big CG battle, is a long expository scene with the mysterious entity behind the creation of TVA. Back in episode 4, the Lokis discovered that TVA was headed by animatronic robots. At first this scene seemed really silly, but then when they revealed these characters were robots, it all made sense. This character they meet at the end, apparently named He Who Remains, played by Jonathan Majors, explains why he created the TVA to trim the branches on the timeline. He's a character who is incredibly smart throughout his variations. So smart that they were all able to travel to different realities and meet each other, teaming up and exerting authoritarian rule of some kind. So he trims the timeline of variants to keep this from happening. But why not just trim the timeline of his variants? Because Apparently, he's the nicest version of himself, and all the other versions are pretty evil. Anyway, the two Lokis decide to throw caution to the wind, and they burn it all down, allowing all variants to exist, creating all kinds of branches, and when they return, he who remains has predictably taken over. I mean, he was already in control, it was just a nicer version, and the next season we get all the variants of his character, I suppose? The end to Loki was exposition heavy, and unfortunately ended on a cliffhanger. I enjoyed that the series kept going to new places that I didn't entirely expect, while the two previous Disney Marvel streaming shows more heavily telegraphed their conclusions. To get into production notes a little bit, while The Falcon and the Winter Soldier started filming in Atlanta October 2019, and WandaVision started in Atlanta November 2019, Loki started February 2020, though all three had to halt filming due to the pandemic. The creator of Loki, Michael Waldron, started as an intern for Adult Swim, worked as a production assistant on Community during its 5th season, and worked as a spec writer on the web show Harmon Quest. So he's served a smaller role on some well-known comedic properties, and is positioned to write the Doctor Strange sequel. He wrote the first and last episodes of Loki, while every episode is directed by Kate Herron, who, besides writing and directing many short films, directed 2 Netflix shows, Sex Education and Daybreak. When you look at the writers and directors for any of these Disney Plus streaming shows, they seem to be relatively unknown. For example, every episode of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier was directed by Kari Skogland, who has been working in TV since 1994, more recently directing 5 episodes of The Handmaid's Tale, 2 episodes of The Walking Dead, 1 episode of Penny Dreadful, 1 episode of Boardwalk Empire, and 6 episodes of The Borgias, so she's a career professional. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier was created by Malcolm Spellman, who wrote the first and last episode, and previously wrote 7 episodes of Empire. WandaVision was directed by Matt Shakman, who directed for a handful of shows, most notably 2 episodes of Game of Thrones' 7th season, The Spoils of War and Eastwatch, as well as directing for Succession, Mad Men, 6 Feet Under, The Boys, Fargo, and It's Always Sunny. Jack Schaefer, the creator of WandaVision, has a dubious list of credits. She co-wrote the stories for Black Widow, The Hustle, Captain Marvel, and Olaf's Frozen Adventure. Her directorial debut was a 2009 sci-fi romantic comedy called Timer, which I've never seen, and likely never will. Loki's actually pretty good. It's my favorite of these new Marvel streaming shows, though I haven't seen the animated series What If, and Hawkeye is just releasing now, but there's a Marvel character I really don't care about, though I'll probably eventually watch the show like a superhero simp anyway. As far as ratings for these Marvel streaming shows, I'd give Loki a solid 7. Maybe even an 8, but I'll restrain myself for now. Somewhere in that range. It's not perfect, but I mostly enjoyed it. There might have been some missed opportunities with how in only 4 episodes they discovered the big secret behind the TVA, and they don't actually jump through time that much. There's the DB Cooper joke, the Renaissance Fair scene, the Pompeii scene, and they do go to the future to spend some time on a world on the brink of destruction. Loki is made with its target audience in mind, and though some might respond to the execution of the fantasy concept as being too light-hearted, it is at the end of the day a Disney show made for family consumption. WandaVision was my least favorite of these new shows, simply because looking back now, it was effectively member berries for boomers. Remember Dick Van Dyke? Remember the Brady Bunch? Remember the Wizard of Oz? Remember Malcolm in the Middle? Do boomers actually remember Malcolm in the Middle? Also, I didn't care for the sword characters. It was really Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany that carried the show, but for me, it was average. 5 out of 10. This show is usually rated a lot higher, but this is one case where I respectfully disagree. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier was a little better. On one hand, it had more action, which WandaVision lacked. 2 of the episodes were directed by John Wick creator Derek Kolstad, and those were the 2 best episodes, especially in terms of action and fighting. I thought the supporting cast was arguably more interesting than the 2 leads, and there was some political commentary, which felt like it was going for some kind of Proud Boys versus Antifa metaphor, but it was written in a really reductive way. Comics can be political, but when Disney tries to make a family-friendly political show, it's kind of in a tough spot because it's going to offend someone, so everything has to be very boilerplate. I've always found political material is better handled through satire, where it doesn't come across quite as preachy. Criticisms aside, I like the Captain America lore, so I'd say at least a 6 out of 10 on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Still an above average show. It's not actually categorized as a limited series as WandaVision is, but I don't think there's going to be a second season because they're doing a film. Meanwhile, Marvel's released 3 movies this year, none of which I've seen, all of which I will, and none of which I'm going to review anytime soon.